Ladies and gentlemen, it's Rick Gaming Telecom video. Post GDC 2016 reports emerged and had stated that the PlayStation 4K was in development. Supposedly it had been shown off to developers, and sources speaking with Kotaku had confirmed that the system would offer much better performance over the vanilla PS4. Fast forward a few days and now further sources have corroborated this, and it would appear that indeed the PlayStation 4 is currently being researched and developed, and Sony are essentially wrapping up the system's development. Now, we don't know when the system is going to be launching, of course, or whether Sony are officially going to go ahead with it. It might just be exploring things right now, but there is certainly something to the rumour. The system does exist, and in this video we're going to be discussing this very fact. This is probably going to be a fairly lengthy video, although maybe tomorrow or a couple of days I will be, I guess you could say, releasing a shorter variant of this very video so we can go over this stuff in, I guess you could say, a more concise way. Now, this is also an article. If you want to go ahead and check it out, it will be linked in the video's description. So let's jump into this, because we're going to be exploring multiple different things. First of all, what could the potential specifications of the system be? What impact will it have on the PlayStation's ecosystem? And what will developers potentially be doing? And also, do I think it's a good idea? And will you, and I'm really interested in your comments on this one, will you buy it for multiple different reasons? We're going to be exploring those. So, first things first. The system is being touted as the PlayStation 4K. That's the, I guess, the working name or whatever it is. Now, first things first. The PlayStation 4, in many titles, is struggling at 1080p. And that's, you know, pretty well known. There's a lot of titles which are running at 900p, basically sub 1080. But even if you say that a game runs at 1080p, the difference between 4K and 1080p is massive. How much? Well, around 4 times the number of pixels. To put that into reference, the PS4's GPU puts out around 1.84 teraflops of performance, which certainly isn't shabby, but it's absolutely piddly compared to the around 7.5 teraflops which the system would need to put out to maintain the same frame rates while contending with the number of pixel per second increase of 4K alone. That is pretty bloody big. Now, let's assume, because we have to make some assumptions here, we need at least some stable ground to work from. Let's assume that the PlayStation 4K is going to be released early to mid next year, which is a solid 12 months-ish away. This means that, by logic, AMD will have, and we can assume that AMD are still going to be the suppliers of this technology. It would make no sense for them to switch architectures, because it would make the coding and creation of games between the two systems absolutely a nightmare. So we know AMD is still going to be supplying the components. Following this logic, Sony could opt to pursue AMD's Polaris architecture. It's well known by now, especially if you've been watching this channel, that Polaris will offer around 2.5 times performance per watt over the current GCN hardware, which is doing the rounds on both PC and, well, that's in the current generation of systems. Bear in mind that the PS4's entire system draws just ever so slightly under 140 watts of power, assuming it's running games. Obviously, if it's not running games, if it's streaming media, it will be considerably less, but at the highest power draw, you're looking at around 140 watts. AMD are pledging to improve performance per dollar, and are also pledging to bring down the cost of virtual reality. For example, the minimum specification of the Oculus Rift is somewhere in the neighbourhood of a GTX 970. It's hoping to reduce that cost of entry by offering a GPU which is equivalently spec'd, or around the same specification in terms of performance of the GTX 970 or the R9 290, but at a cheaper cost. Now, what we know, therefore, is the PlayStation 4 requires 140 watts of power, and the system, when it debuted, was cost $400 US, right? So those are, I guess you could say, those are some stable facts. We know roughly what the system cost, we know how much power it drawn, and therefore we can make some assumptions based upon the next PlayStation 4. We could assume that therefore that the system is going to need at least a similar-ish power draw. They're not going to want to push it up to, like, say, 250 watts of power, because they want to keep the, I guess you could say, the chassis of the PlayStation 4K at least roughly the same size. They can't make it twice the size because people will complain a lot, and they also can't bump the price up massively either. So we know that PS4's GPU could potentially be considerably more powerful, and we'll go back to that in just a moment, but what about the remaining components? Now, we have touched on this previously when we spoke about this very subject, but the PS4's CPU is an 8-core AMD Jaguar, which is clocked at around 1.6 GHz. Developers have run into CPU limitations with the PS4, and this isn't just random developers. These are folks who were the likes of Sucker Punch, who were the likes of Naughty Dog, and they were actually quoted in saying, while the CPU has ended up working pretty well, it's still one of our, and I quote, main bottlenecks, and it's less easy to optimize for the fact it is an out-of-order nature. Now, I don't want to go into the whole in-order versus out-of-order nature of processors, because that's well outside the remit of this video, and it'll take me 5 minutes to explain it. If you want more information, you can either Google it, or we have covered it already. I would suggest maybe watching the PlayStation 3 sell video if you want. It is also an article as well. So, a CPU boost could happen. The PlayStation 4's CPU runs at 1.6 GHz, the Xbox One's Jaguar runs at 1.75. They are the same architecture, there is no real difference apart from the Xbox One does have a clock speed advantage. The maximum speed a Jaguar could run is around 2 GHz. That would assume that the system is being pushed to the absolute limit with the Jaguar cores. Now, AMD's Zen lineup is supposedly going to be released in APUs for next year, and it will be known as Raven Ridge. This year we'll only see equivalently the Excavator cores of APUs. Therefore, Sony would have a choice. They would either get to keep with Jaguar, or they would have to stick with Zen with a lower, I guess you could say, a lower TDP processor, but unfortunately we don't know enough about those APUs to really make an educated assumption. Now, upping the GPU performance is going to mean that CPU performance is also going to go up, and we will go more into how and why the GPU performance could go up in just a moment, I do promise you, but this also logically means RAM. Now, it's not just that the RAM will have to be faster, we're going to need more of it. Developers have already pushed way into the 4.5 GB limits of the PlayStation 4, technically 5 if you count flexible memory. For example, when we saw the breakdown by Guerrilla Games of the Killzone Shadowfall demo, before the PS4 was even launched, we saw that they hit around 3 GB of video memory, which is a lot. That's a lot of memory. We can therefore make the logical assumption that if you're going to go with higher resolutions, higher visual fidelity, you're going to need, that's right, more memory. Furthermore, if you're going to put in a more powerful GPU and a more powerful CPU, you're going to need more memory bandwidth to feed them. HBM is most likely out. There's multiple reasons behind that, but quite simply, it costs too much money right now. Technically, it is physically possible by the time the PS4.5 or PS4K or whatever the hell it ends up being called is released, they could put in 16 GB of HBM2 memory. They could do it, but they won't because it's going to cost most likely too much money. Therefore, they could use GDDR5X. The reason they most likely will use X is because they can offer, the 5X offers twice the bandwidth per pin over regular R5, and because of this, they can get away with adding in fewer additional memory chips, and therefore they don't need to increase the width of the bus more. All you need to know with adding a wider bus is that you need more chips on there, and it increases the complexity of the design of the hardware. This obviously is a bad thing in a limited space PCB. For example, the fact that the motherboard inside the PlayStation 4 is already pretty darn chock full of components. Now we can also make some other logical assumptions. If it will be based upon the Polaris architecture, and there is no reason it wouldn't be, we know that it will offer standards such as HDMI 2. We know it will have HDCP 2.2, and we will also know that it will support wider colour gamuts. We'll go more into that in just a moment. We know this because AMD have confirmed these features. These are not just wishy-washy maybes. We know this. Interestingly, both AMD and Microsoft have also spoken about the need for wider colour gamuts and the general transition to HDR. I've also covered what HDR is in the past, but just to give you the Cliff Notes version, it's essentially being able to display a wider range of colours and a wider range of blacks and whites on screen. You might not think that sounds like a big deal, but when you start dealing with lens flares, really bright scenes, it basically means you're going to be able to squeeze more detail. And in fact, Microsoft went on record during their DirectX 12 Advancements conference, which was held at GDC this year, and said that they believe the adoption rates of HDR displays is most likely going to exceed 4K capable televisions in the near future, let's say the next year to 2 years, simply because for the end customer there's a greater degree of difference. Now, going back to the pricing of the PlayStation 4, we know that the original unit cost Sony $381 to produce. This means that Sony were essentially making around $20 per system. This is assuming, once again, US pricing, because that's the easiest to go with. Okay, right, now we're all on the same page. We know how much it costs to produce the vanilla system. We know how much power the vanilla system cost, and roughly they don't want to go over that. Sure, 10 watts here or there, fine, but they can't go massively over it. We know that they obviously don't want a massive chassis. And we further know that, well, the range of hardware they've got available, right? Great. Now we can start making some educated guessing. Now we can start cooking with gas. So first things first, Sony will most likely take advantage of the 14nm FinFET process. If you don't know what that is, it simply means that you're able to pack twice the amount of transistors in the same space compared to 28nm. Pretty simple. This means that in the case of the GPU, the graphics processor, this means that you're going to be able to offer, in a perfect world, about 2.5 times power performance per watt, as we've discussed with Polaris. So, what are the two options? Because in my opinion, there's two main options. You could start splitting it into multiple, but let's just keep things fairly simple. The first option, option A, is the PlayStation 4K, which is considerably more advanced than the original vanilla model. So for the sake of argument, in this option, Sony would opt to provide a GPU which is between, let's say, 1.5 to 2.5 times the performance of the vanilla model PS4. It's certainly possible they could do that, but I wonder if they're going to be able to do it at a reasonable cost. We'll go more into that in just a second, because what about the processor? Now, potentially, they could push a Jaguar clocked to 2 GHz, which is roughly, let's say, 20 to 25% increase in performance, depending if they manage to get it all the way to 2 GHz, or maybe, a few megahertz off here or there. Sony could add additional Jaguar cores, which is something I thought of for a couple of seconds, but that would mean the PS4 has 12 cores, which 10 of those presumably would be available to games. No, there's just no way that the average developer would have the time, resources, or the sheer willpower to bloody well split the game up across that many processor cores. It's inefficient and it just doesn't make any sense. Therefore, we can assume a high clock Jaguar is one option to go, or Zen. Now, Zen, unfortunately, is the misnomer. We do not know the TDP requirements of Zen. We know from AM4, the new motherboard, that it can, because of 1331 pins, support a TDP of about 140 watts, but that's a maximum TDP of 140 watts, and that is just for the CPU. That is for high-end desktops. That is not for, let's say, the laptops of this world. And remember, essentially, Jaguar is meant for, well, tablets. It's meant for low-power devices. Therefore, desktop Zen equals no. But an APU variant based upon Zen, that could potentially be a yes. Unfortunately, once again, we don't know the TDP or pricing of Zen or the number of cores, so we can only speculate that it's a potential possibility. Now, what does that mean? Well, in terms of raw GPU performance, if you once again go to 2.5 times the performance of a vanilla model PS4, that probably means that 4K games on average are not going to be possible, at least with the levels of visual fidelity that we are expecting maybe, and certainly not at 60 FPS, because that would just be impossible. That's not to say that not all games are going to be able to run at 4K. With HDMI 2.0 plus all of the other additions that I've said here, you're going to be able to certainly run less complicated games at 4K. To put it another way, you can render Quake 1 at 4K a lot easier than you could, let's say, Crysis 3. But this would be rather impressive for titles which maybe could not achieve 60 FPS in the vanilla system, or maybe you would just offer better virtual reality experiences with, once again, the PSVR. And of course, you would also see improvements to, let's say, 4K streaming, multimedia with Netflix, Amazon, maybe better VR content. Essentially, you would see better graphics, and they could make quite a lot of visual difference with the games. Okay, what's option 2? Improved hardware. So the PlayStation 4, we know this for a fact, actually has 20 compute units. 2 of these are disabled for the yields, which is why we have the 1152 shaders that we currently do. Each CU, for your reference, has 64 shaders within it. The PlayStation 4's GPU only runs at 800 MHz. Therefore, technically speaking, a more advanced APU, particularly one that was leveraging 14nm, could potentially hit, let's say 2.5, well, maybe not quite 2.5, let's say 2.1 to 2.3 T-flops of performance if these additional compute units were added and they just decided to run the GPU a little faster, let's say 850 to 900 MHz. That might not sound like a big deal, but it is the difference between the PS4 and the Xbox One now. Roughly around 500 G-flops of GPU performance. Sony could also opt to switch to a new GCN iteration. It could either go with Polaris, which is obviously the new GPU, or Tonga. Now, we don't know whether Tonga is necessarily going to be cheaper, but potentially they could produce it on a 14nm process. Tonga is the same GPU which is found in, let's say, the R9 285 or the R9 380X, those type of GPUs, and it, along with Polaris, have better data compression. This would mean, since they're not really going massively overboard with the additional GPU performance, they're not pushing it to say 2 or 2.5 times or even higher, a modest amount of extra additional clock speed on the memory could potentially do the trick, particularly, as I said, because we've got better compression. Let's say a 6 GHz GDDR5 with much the same bus width and all of that, compared to 5.5 GHz of the current GDDR5, and that should be ample enough to run hardware theoretically. As for the CPU, we could probably imagine a slight tweak in clock speed. Let's say the Jaguar cores would go from, let's say, 1.6 GHz to, let's say, comparable to the Xbox One's 1.75. So, once again, 1.7 to 1.8 GHz. That would be quite a nice upgrade. What would that mean for the PS4? Well, it would mean slightly higher resolution, slightly nicer graphical effects, and potentially better and more stable frame rates. You would also see, of course, additional 4K streaming options, multimedia functionality, and most likely HDR support as well. It would also reduce the cost of this new PS4 model. Now, what does this all mean? Should Sony release a 4K, or rather a PlayStation 4K, or whatever it's going to be called? Well, the benefits of a games console is fixed spec. Let's face it. It's a fixed spec system. This means that you don't have to worry necessarily about hardware upgrades, right? You don't need to worry about hardware upgrades for your PS3. Yeah, but that's not always been the case. The SNES and its FX chip, the Genesis had the 32X, the Sega CD, the Sega Virtual Processor. The Saturn had RAM card upgrades, the N64 had RAM card upgrades, and that's not really trying to name any systems. It certainly was the case in many instances over. But with that said, why have they done that? Well, it's always to improve the visual complexity, the visuals, and just to give gamers better experiences. And because the PlayStation 4 is of course going to be attachable to the PSVR, it needs to power it. Something has to give, most likely. But now we've examined some of the evidence and started to speculate, let's assume that the PlayStation 4 is twice as powerful as the one currently sitting on your store shelf or in your home. Is that enough for you to jump onto this device? Would you upgrade? Now, there are some scenarios here. Let's say you're unable to play PS4K games on a vanilla system, certain titles. Would you feel compelled to upgrade then? For example, Nintendo's new 3DS, which by the way is a freaking terrible name, offers more powerful hardware, for example, better processor. But how many folks upgraded just to play Xenoblade? Very bloody few. This means that we could potentially see a fractured PS4 ecosystem. It's not like a RAM card upgrade with a Saturn, which was comparatively cheap, you know, cost an extra $10, $20, whatever it was, and you got the RAM card, and then you even had the option not to buy certain games without that RAM card. No. You have to plonk down potentially $400 US just to be able to play those games. And at this point, if there's going to be a hardware iteration every 2 to 3 years, how many folks are just going to jump to the PC? And let's assume that the new PS4 was designed for the PSVR. Well, okay, let's say the PS4 VR is going to be released end of this year, which it will be. Well, how many people are then going to want to buy a PS4K 6 months later? I'm sure some will. Some definitely will want to do that, but a lot of folks won't. Now, immediately you could say, well, Phil Spencer had teased Microsoft are going to do very similar. He did, but then he somewhat recanted and said they are thinking about it in the future. I'm not quoting him verbatim, but that's basically what he said. Now, whether he was trying to do damage control remains to be seen, but the fact of the matter is, the Xbox One is basically at this point an entry-level Windows 10 PC gaming machine. You're going to get to play your Quantum Breaks, you're going to get to play your Forzas, your Gears of War, for a cheaper price. It has worse graphics, it has slower loading times, it has less upgradability, you can't play, you know, on such a wide ecosystem, you don't have such great backwards compatibility, but it costs a lot less money. To Microsoft, they don't give a shit though. They don't care whether you're playing on Windows 10 on the PC. They don't care if you're playing on the Xbox One. They just care that you are buying bloody Quantum Break because they get money for that. Sony don't have that luxury. If they don't sell you Uncharted 4 on the PlayStation 4, if they don't sell you or can't sell you a game on the PSVR, or developers switch to the PC or a different platform, they can't make money. So to Phil Spencer, it matters a lot less. He's happy to have you go with the Xbox One because your friends or buddies are on it, or because it's a lot cheaper, or he's happy for you to spend £1,500 on a high-spec PC or spend £500 on a PC. It's completely up to you, as long as you're, in his mind, giving him money. Now, this also means a rather interesting scenario for developers. Let's assume that the games run on the PS4 and PS4K, which have already been released. So let's assume Naughty Dog released Uncharted 4 and you try to put that into the PS4K. What happens? Would they release a patch, presumably for free, which would improve the resolution, the frame rate, or the visual quality of the game? Okay, that's potentially possible, but what about games which are released in the future, which are potentially competitive in nature? Now, we're not talking about single-player games here, right? Because if you're playing on Uncharted 4, let's just say, for the sake of argument, Uncharted 5, and you are playing on your PS4K, and I'm playing on the vanilla, regular old PlayStation 4. My version runs at 900p, 30 FPS, your version runs, let's say 1440p at 60 FPS. Let's just say a massive gulf in difference. If it's single player, I don't care necessarily. Yes, I'm going to have worse graphics, but I'm still going to get to enjoy the gameplay. What happens though if I'm playing against you in Killzone or Call of Duty, and I'm once again playing on my vanilla regular PlayStation 4, you are playing on your shiny, oh my god, what the hell has just come from outer space machine? Well, you might not think that's a big deal. We're both playing on control pad, right? It's not like you're playing on keyboard and mouse and therefore massacring me. But you can have more stable frame rates. You can have high resolution display. You can have better graphics. You can have better draw distance potentially. And here's the rub. If you don't have those, you might bitch. You might say, well, I just paid more money for that, so why haven't the developers taken advantage of the hardware? On the other hand, if you did, couldn't I bitch and say, well, excuse me, Mr. Killerphon 3000 over there is basically sniping me from a distance I can't see him. Kind of the unfair. Now you might say to yourself, well, that's easily fixed. Just make it so that vanilla owners play against vanilla owners. Yeah, but then you immediately start splitting up the ecosystem. And what if you are friends with Tom and Tom can't afford the new system, or vice versa? What the hell? Secondly, how difficult will it be for games to be optimized on this new system, or both systems? We know that the PlayStation 4 uses a low-level API known as GNM. The higher level is known as GNMX, and it's meant to basically emulate a lot of the functionalities of DirectX. Well, okay. What happens if there's a glitch, or the hardware doesn't run properly? Once again, let's assume that 12 months have passed, the PS4K has been released, you mosey on in to your local retailer, you trade in vanilla PS4, you buy the new PS4, right? So you've traded in vanilla, you've got 4K. Great. You go home and you put in a couple of new games, and you're all happy. Then you decide, a week's gone by, I fancy playing something a bit different. You put in an older game. Let's say, for the sake of argument, it doesn't really matter. You put in a game. Okay, two potential scenarios. The game runs fine, absolutely no bother. But I can almost guarantee you, there is going to be something that doesn't run properly. Because the game was created with a certain amount of shaders in mind, a certain amount of memory in mind, a certain number of CPU cycles in mind, a certain amount of GPU performance in mind, a certain graphics drivers, a certain hardware, a certain architecture. Now, it might not be a big problem, it might not cause the system to crash, but it might mean that the game is slightly mistimed, it might mean the physics are slightly off, it might mean that something just doesn't run how you would expect it to. Well, does a developer therefore have a responsibility to patch this? I don't know, do they? Arguably, they kinda do, but realistically, if you're a studio, can you be expected to patch a game a year later after it's finished development? 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? And what if your studio has gone bankrupt? Well, then what? Or what if you've lost the license for that, like Marvel vs. Capcom 3, when Capcom just lost the license for it, so they could not, well, update the game anymore. That's why there are so many bloody glitches and so many exploits and whatever else in the game, and Capcom didn't do literally shit. It's not their fault. They've lost the license. They're not allowed to touch the game. Yeesh. Right. Now, I know I sound really negative on the PlayStation 4K, and I don't mean to be. It might sound like I'm really coming down on it like a ton of bricks, and I'm not. It's just, it opens up a lot of questions on how tolerant people are going to be and developers are going to be with the idea. Because, let's face it, I'm a tech lover. I would actually be really curious how it would do in the market, but I'm that way inclined. I would probably buy the damn thing just to see the differences. But I am a bit of a masochist in this respect. I'm not saying that I'm sensible. A lot of folks won't. They just won't do it. And the problem is you've got the NX coming out. Let's assume that Nintendo don't be Nintendo for a moment. Let's say that they're vaguely competent with marketing. Let's say they're vaguely competent about not pissing off developers. Let's say they're vaguely competent of not pissing off their customers. I know this sounds amazing. I know it sounds unlikely, but it could happen. If they stop stabbing themselves in the eye for a moment and they actually stopped, screwing themselves over constantly, they could be a really big threat if Sony are scuppering their own chances. Assuming the NX is a fairly competent, technically, machine at least, and we've already seen rumours of the controller, we've seen images of the controller floating about, Sony could have a reverse situation of what happened in the PS1 versus N64 days, when Nintendo pissed off a lot of developers. It pissed off customers by releasing games on cart, which meant developers could not put games like Final Fantasy VII on the machine, and the games which were on the machine were bloody expensive. This is for multiple different reasons, and therefore, what the hell? People just flocked to the PlayStation. It was easier to develop for than the Saturn. It had the CD capabilities. It was well documented, and Nintendo did not do a great job with documentation. They split up the market some because they were the only ones with cartridges, while the Saturn and the PlayStation were moving towards CD. And yes, you can argue the Saturn wasn't exactly competitive in the marketplace, particularly in the end, but it was irrelevant to developers, especially in the early years. Well, yeah, but the Saturn still had a CD drive. You could still put Resident Evil on it. Now, I know what you're going to say, Resident Evil 2 was on the N64, but look at the size of the cartridge. It had to come out later when prices of the chips in the cartridge were cheaper, and they had to still do a ridiculously good job at the compression of that data. Furthermore, and this is probably the biggest one, it really just didn't help Nintendo. So, what do I think? I think that it's going to be an interesting scenario. Presumably we will see a slimline PS4, because Sony have done it for every single model of PlayStation thus far, so therefore it makes a good deal of sense they're going to do it again. If they were to do it, and let's say the PS4 was to be twice as powerful, would you buy it? This PS4K? And what happens with the PlayStation 5? For example, let's say, once again, February comes around, March comes around. Let's say March, because that's 12 months into the future. The PS4K is released. Well, when is the next PlayStation coming out? The PlayStation 5? Because I've got to tell you, if it's not until 2017 next year, let's say it's 2020, 2021, that's a fucking long time. I'm sorry, but the iteration of hardware by that point is going to be pretty minuscule. Twice the GPU performance it's pretty impressive. But even if you say that that means the PS4 hits, and I'm being generous, 5 T-flops at roughly twice the performance, right? 2.5 times the performance, which would be roughly within the price range of what Sony could potentially do, what customers are willing to pay out, and all of the other stuff that we've discussed. That's still piddly compared to the next generation of GPUs coming out from Nvidia and AMD, which means they're still going to be way behind the curve again in 12 months' time. And they can't keep releasing new APUs. They can't keep releasing these intermediary steps. So the reason they would do that, of course, is for the PlayStation VR, which is definitely one way to go. But I wonder if, well, let's say once again, 1.5 times, 2 times the performance, if that's going to be enough for folks to care. Now, I'm not saying they will or they won't, but I'm just raising concerns that I've seen a lot of on the internet. For me, I am very curious to see what Sony do. I actually really want them in some ways to release the machine, not because I want them to fail, but because I want them to actually succeed and shake up the market. And I want them to do it right. I want them to maybe offer a trade-in for the PlayStation 4 that we've already got, which is not $2.50. I want them to offer a decent trade-in and have shorter iterations of hardware. And I hope for the future they actually do it as a slot. So you just have a small slot, you spend $50, you get a new APU, or a new add-on, which plugs into the system and it increases the performance of the machine. And Bob's your uncle. It makes the whole iteration of hardware a lot easier. That would be great, and I think that's maybe what Microsoft are going to do with the next Xbox. Potentially. Let me know your thoughts on this one. I could speak a lot about it. I'm excited, morbidly so. I'm excited, I'm curious, I'm cautious, and dare I say optimistic. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Once again, this is also an article, so go ahead and check it out if you manage to somehow survive this 40-ish minutes. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.